Hello again. Today I'm going to play one of the most difficult factory mods in Minecraft, Enigmatica 2 Expert. This collection of mods allows realistic chemical factories, space travel, god equipment, insane boss fights, and a lot more stuff, taking 500 hours of my life away from 2 separate playthroughs. Over the past 2 months I've posted a bit of E2E content showing the last 40 hours of my playthrough, and a lot of you wanted to see the full thing, but I only started recording after getting the creative tank. This video, however, I will show the full history of my playthrough. Before that, I wanted to let you know that I have a small Discord server with some of my subscribers and even God himself on there, and if you join, it will bless you. Also, I will let you into a competitive modded server I'm starting relatively soon, also subscribe. Anyways, let's get back to E2E. In case you don't know what E2E is, it stands for Enigmatica 2 Expert, which, as you may have expected, is the expert version of Enigmatica 2. The pack is centered around the Gates quest line, which is a comprehensive progression line for the pack, with each vertical level on the quest line being tiers in progression, starting with Industrial Age mods in Tier 1, all the way to Blood Magic, Warp Drives, and God Equipment at Tier 4, setting it apart from its non-expert version. It is mainly centered around these tech mods with magic on the side, and the end goal is to make the 4 creative items to make the creative vending upgrade to duplicate any item including itself in a drawer. Once you make that, you are essentially in creative mode and can do whatever you want, and it is the pack I will be playing today. It all started in November of 2021 when I was talking to my friend about possibly playing modded Minecraft together. Before this I had only really played 2 mod packs, SevTech and Sky Factory. But I had never beat any mod packs, and Sky Factory got boring after the first 2 hours. So this friend showed me a video created by the YouTuber I Go By Lots of Names about Enigmatica 2 Expert, and I was interested. Pretty soon, however, we realized we didn't know how to do multiplayer, and gave up, but the next day I started a single player world, and the grind began. I started by looking at the pack's quests to figure out the best way to progress, and decided that I would get all the way up to here in the start quest line, and then move to my favorite mod at the time, Immersive Engineering. On day 1, I made a tiny Tinker's Construct smeltery, which was like a dwarven forge to melt metals and cast them into tools, and used it to get my first copper tool, allowing me to mine Certus quartz, to sharpen it, and then back to the mines for iron. This long mining level progression was actually quite interesting to me, and was probably the only reason I kept playing, since I had no experience automating things, no knowledge of applied energistics, and was completely overwhelmed by how bad the late game recipes looked. My goal was to stick to what was familiar, so I rushed the thermal series of mods and nuclear craft because I couldn't reach big reactors like I wanted to. What the hell? No! And then after that I would go for the only ore generation I know, mystical agriculture, which allows you to grow various materials with plants. By the end of the first week I had an immersive engineering setup and an ME drive for digital storage.
Nice.
It was quickly becoming apparent that my goals were stupid, since crafting the machine case for thermal was way too difficult and involved my 2 greatest enemies, forestry and industrial craft. Once I got the machine case though, I realized that all this brute force up to thermal was exhausting, and for what? All I had acquired with it was a redstone furnace and an induction smelter, but in getting those I learned about the nuclear furnace and the nuclear craft alloy smelter, which rendered them useless. To get my mind off these failures, I went for the last goal, which is resource generation, and after almost a month of learning Thaumcraft, a week of astral sorcery, and another week of messing around in Botania, I failed. A week later, my computer was reset with a new SSD, and the old hard drive was just gone. So the first attempt ended with absolute failure on all fronts. I stopped playing and moved on to some Factorio and Terraria. But this story doesn't end here. After 3 months of a Factorio playthrough with a friend that eventually abandoned the playthrough, I was inspired to continue E2E, and sometime in late February 2022, I started the second attempt. I had no logical reason to do so, and with my lack of skill, I should have just turned around and played something else. But I was going to try this and not expect anything out of it. When I loaded in, I was facing directly into dirt and was surrounded by ocean. I had the worst possible spawn at the edge of an Alps biome with mountains going more than 150 blocks high, surrounded by a vast ocean. Now I had to climb all the way up to the top to see if there were any trees. So far so good. I eventually found this house and destroyed it and its inhabitants to get furnaces and chests, which have their recipes slightly modified in this pack, and then made a boat and sailed in a random direction. Once I landed, I made a sort of log cabin, which to this day has not been completed. And then I made a smeltery just like last time. Unlike last time, however, I wanted to go big. I've learned about UU matter from Industrial Craft, which in E2E essentially allows you to turn energy into these important items. And energy is very easy to get infinitely, so the new plan was to get progression in the Major Tech mod mechanism and use its tools to help with getting UU matter. And then I had a vague idea of getting the laser drill for ore generation. So in the spirit of this new big mindset, I made a triple layer smeltery, able to smelt 27 ores at once, and then immediately started immersive engineering with a coke oven for coal coke and steel in this blast furnace. The steel and blast brick was used with blocks of osmium to get my first mechanism machine case, used to get this, a metallurgic infuser. And after making this machine, and all these machines, and all this, I had my masterpiece, an ore purification setup. At this point, I was getting kind of addicted, and a theme was setting in: lack of resources. So I was having power problems with my new machine upgrades, and with me now wanting to get some thermal foundation machines to also work towards the void miner, I needed lots more power, and hydrogen gas burners, solar, and wind power was just not enough. So I decided that I needed to make a nuclear reactor. The biggest part of this was getting lead, and that meant mining, lots of mining. Then I needed lithium, steel, and boron for all of this, the advanced plating used with the basic plating to make the reactor controller, and finally the casing. But first, more mining. I made the reactor, but realized that keeping it on was annoying, so it stayed off 40% of the time, but the lack of resources was becoming a big problem, to the point where I was using the minimum level of machines with these low-level leadstone flux ducts due to budget cuts. So naturally, to fix this, I forgot about it and made a computer storage system. The next goal on my list was the Angel Ring, which allows creative-like flight as long as you have what's called grid power, most of the time produced by these things called water mills. Why I wanted this was so that I could travel easier and also move around my base easier, since I had an idea to widen the spaces to allow flight. I began work on this, and it only took 2 days even with my unautomated resource empty base, and while on call with my friend, I took off for the first time in the playthrough. To fix this, I left the game and said that I would never play again. But again, you could probably tell there's a lot left in this video. I started an E2E save with another friend, which ended with him using way too many materials and then trying to tell me that the Earth is flat. So after that, I decided I would research why I died using the Angel Ring, and figured out that it was because I was unloading the water mills and lost all my grid power, so I just have to chunk load them. So I did that. And it worked. E2E was back. Coming back to the playthrough, I realized that frankly, my base was dog crap, and I needed to make a new one. In my Nomi Factory playthrough that I had for 2 days, I had a base plan underground with floors circling a pit in the middle, down to lava. It was also going to be organized with the top floor being power generation, second floor being general machines, third floor being magic, fourth floor being endgame, and bottom floor being advanced rocketry multi-blocks. Getting on for the first time in 2 months, I immediately made an electrum and steel hammer to mine 9 blocks at a time to dig the new base. Once set up, I moved the nuclear reactor and 6 new wind turbines in, and once the machine line was set in place, I moved the computer storage system, and after tearing up everything left at the old base, it was time to do some progression. The first thing I wanted was the previously mentioned UU matter setup, and to do that I needed advanced alloy, and carbon plates for these 3 machines. There's also all of these materials, which needed quite a few extra machines. Lapatron has a recipe that looks like this, and was the hardest part, but to me, only meant I needed a compressor. Advanced alloy and carbon plates also needed the compressor, and the rest just took a couple hours to make in the crafting table. I soon learned the immense power cost of E2E matter, which I spent 2 days trying to negate with this scrapper wall, where I learned about item ducts, which would be used for the rest of the playthrough. But it still wasn't enough. I had never automated nuclear fuel, so the reactor was unreliable, and wind power wasn't scalable enough to reach my power demands. Trust me, I tried. So I did some research and found the gas turbine, which is an easily expandable turbine that runs on gases like hydrogen or ethylene. So I made the first major spaghetti factory of the playthrough for automatic ethylene, and the turbine produced over 10,000 RF, which is energy units, every tick, which is a 20th of a second, so 200,000 RF a second. With power fixed, I moved back to E2E matter, where I looked at the crystal memory required for teaching it what to duplicate. This required 1 new machine, a pressurizer from Nuclearcraft, which is when I fully learned how useful Nuclearcraft would be throughout the playthrough. This is also around the time I learned about Applied Energistics autocrafting. How autocrafting works is when you have a computer storage system, from now on referred to as a matter energy or ME system, with just this ME drive and a terminal like I did. The terminal uses 1 channel, and the drive uses 1 channel. I don't know where the channels come from for now, but there are 8 channels, for whatever you want to do with storage. But storage is the only thing you can do until you get an ME controller, which can add up to 32 channels per side, limited by the cable, and allow interface and crafting storage usage. Interfaces allow you to add crafting patterns in them and link up molecular assemblers and automatically craft items on demand. It gets complex when you use processing patterns, which are way more flexible when you code the individual items and what comes out. So in my first auto-crafting system, I have an electric furnace here and an interface here. The interface puts iron dust into the redstone furnace and expects iron ingots back. The furnace outputs into the interface and is sent into storage. This can also be chained together where you order iron bars, for example, and if you've coded the recipes, it'll crush iron ore into dust and then smelt it. This system can grow almost infinitely and led to some truly beautiful contraptions way later in the pack. The size of this playthrough was finally setting in. I had gotten farther than last time, and even farther than I ever thought I could go. I had E2E matter, a huge base, and I felt like an absolute genius after figuring out autocrafting. What started as a small Minecraft playthrough just for fun after the collapse and burnout of every other game I had played, became a dedicated quest to get to the end, and I was routing the entire thing now. I was also now taking screenshots of my progress, finally adding documentation, and my playtime had risen from 1 to 2 hours a day to 5 to 8 hours, speeding up my progress and getting me to learn way more to prevent most of the old mistakes I made. My next faraway goal was the Void Miner, which needed many things that we'll get to, but the first and most important material was the iridium reinforced plate. Iridium needed some new machines, including the induction smelter to make. The induction smelter is from one of the major tech mods in E2E, Thermal Foundation, which is the most commonly seen tech mod in any mod pack on this version. There's one problem: I needed the machine frame, which is what I spent most of last attempt trying to reach, only to learn that it's not even that useful. This time it is useful, but there's still the roadblock of that recipe, so I began making my way through forestry and actually additions to make the iron casing, and then moving into industrial foregoing a bit more, and finally the RF Tools machine frame to get the machine frame much easier than last attempt. And then I made the redstone furnace for high speed and auto smelting, and then the previously mentioned induction smelter and made iridium. The next difficult material is litherite, which needs another thermal foundation machine, the fluid transposer, and to let it run I needed the magma crucible. To make litherite I need to melt this material called inderium in a magma crucible, and then put molten inderium into the fluid transposer, then put a terrestrial artifact in the fluid transposer to get 1 litherite. I need to do this 36 times. The difficult part is the terrestrial artifact, since inderium's main cost is platinum, which I got when making iridium. Terrestrial artifacts need the empowerer, which is an actually additions machine that uses these 4 display stands around it to function. To start this, I needed the atomic reconstructor, the main machine for actual additions, and I used it to turn quartz into ethic quartz for the 5 display stands, and then used one of those with iron casing to make the empowerer, and used it to make 8 of the 9 crystals needed for the terrestrial artifact. Why didn't I get the last crystal? Well, because... diamonds are the... wait. Diamantine is the hardest part of the recipe since it needs exotic materials like mana diamonds, zirconium, and malachite. Zirconium just needed a new machine, which was getting annoying to do, so I added the alloy smelter to auto-crafting so that I could automate tough alloy. Mana diamonds are made in the mana pool, which means I need to break the contract with the UN about never using a magic mod again. And I had to get through Thaumcraft, Astral Sorcery, and finally reach Botania. Wait, no, Go. Fun fact about malachite, it's a form of copper ore that is fairly common in real life. Its chemical formula is this if you care. But for some reason, I can't just find malachite in the ground because for some reason they removed it. So I had 2 options here. Make a different kind of laser drill that was very expensive and I'd rather not talk about it, or use these sieves with endstone gravel to find all of these gems, which included malachite. With Botania unlocked, I could make the Botania items required for the sieve, and get the final item for the terrestrial artifact. There's one last problem for making the Void Miner that I didn't think about before. It's a multi-block, which means there are, you guessed it, multiple blocks. The only blocks that matter here, though, are the structure frames, which look cheap here until you look at the interconnect, which needs these connectors, which needs tin. Lots of tin. So much tin, in fact, that it was time for. With this new cost and how deep crafting trees are getting, I need to look into auto-crafting and try to get some larger systems. I thought about what was necessary to expand auto-crafting and figured out that if crafting computers and interfaces could be easily auto-crafted, then I could expand it at will to every conceivable machine almost effortlessly. So that's exactly what I did. The other problem, which isn't solved by 200 auto-crafting patterns, is tin. I needed lots of tin. The Paris catacombs under my base had a sustained ore collection until now, but growth was getting stunted by my 2-hour mining trips every week. I needed another source of ore collection that isn't the Void Miner since I can't get that yet, and that's when my Sky Factory brain kicked in. I have a sieve now, and that's the only ore collection method in Sky Factory. Surely I could make some system to automatically make metal out of infinite cobblestone in E2E, right? Upon further inspection, yes. I could use the nuclear craft cobblestone generator to produce 8 stone a second and put it into mechanism crushers and then sieve the gravel created in that to make various exotic metals. So I immediately got to work making the machines for that and used import buses from Applied Energistics to bring it all straight to storage. Suddenly making the Void Miner doesn't seem that good, but I'm too invested now. It also makes litherite automatically, and I thought if a cheap sieving setup was enough to fill my storage system while I was at church for an hour, then the laser drill should be good, right? So I kept going and automated ore doubling by putting ore in an enrichment chamber to make 2 dust from 1 ore, and then putting the dust in the previously mentioned redstone furnace. Then I grew crafting storage to support the huge recipe to make over 1,000 tin blocks required for all the connectors for the Void Miner, and at the end of the 10th month, I had the drill. I turned the miner on and watched 1 measly ore every 3 seconds go into the crate. Well, there are 3 good things that came out of this. I got litherite, I learned that sieving is actually useful, and I got the achievement of actually reaching one of these far-fetched goals. So what's next? I decided that I needed to make more power since I goofed the ethylene setup and didn't want to fix it. So I began thinking about forms of power gen. Auto-uranium into low-enriched uranium fuel for huge fission reactors, a bigger gas setup, maybe thousands of wind turbines. Eventually, I came to a conclusion. For this I needed resources, lots of them. I needed 700 steel, 1,000 lead, 700 boron, 1,400 lithium, over 10,000 redstone, and hundreds of solenoids. This was going to be a huge project for just a minimum size fusion reactor. Most of that I already had, so the main roadblock was redstone. Since I didn't have sand sifting yet, Redstone had to be made with the void miner, and the same goes for lithium and boron. So I ended up making the tier 2 void miner to get as much as possible. I then had to help it get resources since it was so slow, so I mined for the lithium and boron and put a red lens on the void miner to increase the chance for getting redstone. After 5 play sessions of either idling or mining, I had the resources and it was time to build. Once that was all put together, I made 14 pumps with speed upgrades and filters to get heavy water, which I electrolyzed to get 1 bucket of deuterium every second. And finally, with the combination of all my power production flowing into the electromagnets to power up the most expensive machine I had ever owned, I could finally turn on the fusion reactor. With no outside input, this reactor was producing nearly 500,000 RF a tick, and power had truly been solved. With the fusion reactor, auto-crafting, and auto-sieves, I had a fully self-sustaining base, ready to enter tier 4 mods like Ender.io. Welcome back to part 2. I'm back from vacation and it's time to continue with some more modded Minecraft. Since last time the video's blown up and since so many of you guys subscribed, I'm gonna announce the first sub goal in this channel's history. If I pass 3-fold in subscribers, I will play GTNH until I either beat it or physically can't anymore, and that is a promise. So last time I explained the journey it was getting into E2E, losing a playthrough, coming back again to build this tiny house, and then eventually growing out of it to build my current facility. At the end of last episode, I fixed all of my power and resource problems with an auto-sieve setup and a deuterium-based fusion reactor, so now, let's continue. With no maintenance, this fusion reactor was now producing 440,000 RF a tick. I could finally retire my fission reactor, which I had been manually filling with fuel to kickstart machines. I could also stop maintaining the gas turbine setup since I designed it so badly. Idiot. So next on my mid to late game to-do list is titanium, since I thought I should try to finish the Gates questline and unlock Draconic evolution so that I can begin working on my first creative items. But with that finished, I could use this power to move into a much more energy intensive mod that I was for once slightly familiar with, Ender.io. To start the mountain of a task it was to get to Ender.io, I needed a faster version of the Empowerer since getting titanium and all the infrastructure before that needs empowered crystals and these cell frames, so it was time to make the combination crafter. Looking at the recipe, the main thing is crystal tine ingots, which among other things need an elite crafting table. For an old reactor that I used temporarily, I did get the basic crafting table, but I needed the advanced crafting table with this crafting chain, and the 4 hardened and 2 signalum cell frames that are both part of a much larger crafting tree that we will see a lot later, so I'll explain it now. To start, we duplicate machine frames with UU matter and add redstone in the metallurgic infuser. Then add all 4 of these materials in an empowerer to make the hardened frames. Then I need to use our old friend the fluid transposer to take destabilized redstone and put it over electrum and diamonds to make flux crystals and fluxed electrum used in these parts of the recipe. After that, we need to wait a minute for the fluid transposer to put 4 ingots of this alloy called lumium into the cell frame to finally be upgraded again with all of this stuff that doesn't actually matter except for the resin that has its own factory. Then into the induction smelter with 40 blocks of redstone for 2 minutes to finally make 1 signalum cell frame. And after building all of that, along with some alloys that don't matter, I present to you the elite crafting table. Just a crafting table, but bigger. It only took up until. Now back to the combination crafter. All I had to do at this point was make the crystal tine, which is easier than it looks, and then get the hundreds of black iron for the pedestal since I was going for a max size setup. So I automated the induction smelter and coated it with the most expensive black iron recipe using a block of invar and black quartz to make 2 ingots, which is way worse than the alternatives, but I had too much black quartz and I didn't want to automate anything for the others, so I didn't. I got all the black iron and immediately dumped it into the carpenter with liquefacted coal to make all the components, and then placed them all together with the extended crafting tables on the endgame floor. That was a huge distraction from the main goal, which is modularium automation, but it was worth it since I tried making modularium near the end of the first attempt and it absolutely sucked. Also, there were all of these recipes that the combination crafter could do, and it would be important for later. The next day I planned my first weird factory. This setup is weird since I can't use one interface to go into all the pedestals at once, unless I knew about item lasers, but how I made it work is by outputting into this chest and then using tons of filters in pipes going into 4 of the pedestals since I only needed 4 for automation, and then pull out the item using another filter just for these outputs. Finally, you can get the Advanced Metallurgic Fabricator for actual titanium production. For this, I made 2 machines from Gendustry, and at the time of making the Metallurgic Fabricator, you only needed glowstone or redstone for mutagen instead of plutonium like it is now, and I made lots of mutagen for this part of the multi-block. Then the 6 fiery blocks. In case you don't know, fiery metal is a powerful material added by the Twilight Forest mod that needs fiery Hydra blood or Urgas tears. To save the explanation, those are 2 mid-game bosses in the Twilight Forest which have a chain of requirements to reach that include other bosses, all within the Twilight Forest dimension. Getting there wasn't that hard, but I quickly learned that I couldn't fly, so I had to resort to old technology, like walking, and touching the ground, which is made of that horrible grass. I actually ended up just using a slime sling to propel myself into a Naga lair. Then I killed the Naga, went to the Twilight Lich, killed him, which wasn't actually that straightforward since he has a shield wall and I had to deflect projectiles to destroy it. Then I killed the Phantom Knights, which are also quite difficult since I kept looking in the wrong direction while shooting. Then I finally used my slime sling to fly up to the top of an Urgas tower and killed the Urgast and took its tears. With that and all the previously auto-crafted modularium, I can assemble the Advanced Metallurgic Fabricator. But it's not done yet because now I have to make titanium. All that matters is the liquid chlorine here since everything else is easy. Because I didn't know anything about the thermal evaporation plant, I went with the more difficult route of melting salt and electrolyzing it to make chlorine. The only problem was that this meant one salt turned into 1.5 millibuckets of chlorine. I needed 500 millibuckets per titanium. So I made a chlorine factory, and before any government agency takes me away and locks me in a room, this is a video game. So then I had to make salt, lots of salt. So much salt that I spent 30 minutes making a sink that produces 2.1 million buckets of water to my kitchen, so that I could handcraft 3 stacks of salt every second until I filled 5 of these crates, and since 4 salt makes a block, that means 1 salt is 0.25 cubic meters, and the 5 crates are storing 10,240 cubic meters, which, for my American viewers, equals 24,975,609 Big Macs, packed together perfectly in a cube, turned into salt. That's a lot of salt. So now I have carpal tunnel. Oh, and lots of titanium. Then I wanted the really efficient advanced rocketry machines, but they needed lots of expensive things, but I had most of them stockpiled except elite plating, which needed a new chemical factory since the old one wasn't automated. So I made a new one. How this absolute pile of spaghetti works is it makes sulfuric acid in this line of machines and uses water to dissolve fluorite and mix it with the sulfuric acid to make calcium sulfate and hydrofluoric acid, which I trash. The remaining calcium sulfate is crystallized and crushed for use in elite plating that I'm needing more and more now. With all that made, you get the drill. I made
many different types of machines and factories with machines in them.
The most notable of which is this arc furnace, which is really fast and gives a 4 times cheaper sand to silicon recipe, as well as a really efficient titanium aluminide recipe. Other machines include this cutting machine and the precision assembler for really fast circuit production, and these 3 machines for later. Once I had all this, I automated the machine chassis for my first Ender IO machine, the alloy smelter. Then I used it to automate industrial die blend for the industrial machine chassis, and then made more machines. So let's check on the auto-crafting section of the base, which is going great. By now I had automated a lot. What started as a cool thing I could do to speed up small tasks in one corner of my base was now spreading like a cancer of ME cables throughout my base. The auto-crafting page in storage was no longer a small grocery list, but instead a wall of machines, metals, circuits, alloys, and random garbage I only needed once. The scary part was that the tiny cave I made this in was also growing to accommodate the 40 plus machines with the crafting computers and molecular assemblers, and I needed to dedicate space and channels for molecular assemblers since I ran out of the interfaces for them and I needed them separate. So to fix this mess, I made this room with 2 very large crafting computers and possibly enough space to triple the amount of machines automated, or better, to fill it with 60 molecular assemblers and 20 interfaces. Now I need to enter Draconic Evolution and look towards the Draconic core, which needs a lot of automation, but as I just said, we can do that now. So I got together some crazy recipes, including automating nuclear waste out of a new reactor I've mentioned to automatically assemble Draconic cores in a record time of 8 seconds. So one of the last steps toward creative items is mystical agriculture, which is surprisingly easy considering how hard it was in the first attempt. Since I had mechanized the Botania setup by automating lava production for these thermal lilies, I had lots of mana to make things like terrasteel and elementium, which were both needed for the Master Infusion Stone, and it only took me 2 days to get, which after spending weeks on the factories below ground, it was kind of underwhelming. Once I had that, I made draconium seeds to make draconium without deep dark portals or other crap like that. Then I made nether star seeds and set my sights on awakened draconium seeds, which of course need awakened draconium. To get this I needed many things which normally would be quite expensive if I hadn't made Yuya matter and automated combination crafting. This was also where I finally used my Ender IO machines to make grains of the end. But there was one problem which I didn't notice originally. The fusion recipe tier was Wyvern instead of the basic setup I had. How fusion crafting works is very similar to combination crafters and empowerers, except it has this long charge time since it's more advanced and made for Draconic Evolution. To get to the point, it has tiers of crafting that start at basic and go to Wyvern, Draconic, and Chaotic, which also just so happen to be the 4 main tiers for all of Draconic Evolution, and the tier of crafting is determined by which crafting injectors are being used. Right now my setup was using these cheap basic crafting injectors since it's so new, but I needed to upgrade them, which was difficult. Luckily it only took 2 hours to get everything in order to make the Draconic cores required for this. Unluckily, I needed the Wyvern cores, which needed another modularium machine. Since I had made a lot of infrastructure between now and the last one of these multi-blocks, this was actually easy and I had the machine online in only 4 hours. And even made a small factory for primal mana so that I can have semi-automation for this. After messing around with nuclear waste and nether stars from the garden cloche setup, I had made 9 Wyvern cores and turned them into fusion injectors, making these 8 blocks the most expensive blocks I had so far. Finally I made the awakened draconium and began growing it in garden cloches, which are like fields in boxes. And then because my armor sucked, I decided I would upgrade it to Wyvern, just for fun. Not to fight anything in particular, just fun. Now with this armor, I set out to clear the gate's questline so that I could focus solely on creative equipment, and more specifically, the creative tank. The only thing stopping me was blood magic, which I did have experience with, and ended up making this massive thing to clean out that end of the quest book. And then I started to work on the ultimate crafting table. This was the culmination of all the factories I had been making for hours now, needing crystaltine, advanced circuits, signalum cell frames, and advanced materials like mirian, enderium, and aethium. The first thing I needed was a better void miner, since what I was using was just iridium since I had upgraded it once. But now I needed to upgrade it to the chironite, palladium, and finally ionite void miners to get aethium, which would need 8,640 tin, but that could just be done with my new and improved Ender IO ore doubling, able to turn 25 ore into 50 ingots every second. The other problem was draconium crystals, which need draconium dissolved in sulfuric acid to make. So I made the chemical dissolution chamber, which I would talk about the recipe for, but I don't want to, so I won't. In the time it took to make those, I'd auto-crafted everything except the void miner, and did some base building to give it the look it has now, and to integrate auto-crafting into the base more since I originally thought it would just be in the wall. With the void miner complete, I grabbed the Atheum and assembled the ultimate crafting table. I'd learned every mod and even completed some. I had almost all the factories I needed and mastered auto-crafting. My base felt almost unstoppable, and it was time to truly test it against these two recipes, Benitoid and Anglesite. I decided to do some math and figured out exactly how much of these two I would need for the rest of the playthrough. My first goal for creative items was actually the creative mana pool, because I hate making mana, and I could make Benitoid much easier with it. Because of this, I was only going to make as much Benitoid as I needed, and began work immediately after making the ultimate table. There's a lot to take in here, and most of it was just like the celestial crystals here. Some rock crystals that you made in large quantities with your laser drill, throw it in liquid starlight with some other easy materials that I already have, and wait. There are also other materials like the resonating gem that are easy on paper, until you realize that I need over a stack of these in the entire recipe, and I can only do 2 recipes at a time while manually refilling starlight and clicking on the altar. So things like that needed to be automated, and this requirement led to something truly beautiful. Once all the magic stuff was done, I could already make the creative mana pool, which was just more of the same at this point. This was truly a productive month. Welcome back again. Over the last 3 months, I've summarized my playthrough of E2E starting all the way back in November of 2021, and in that time I was able to build this massive base housing my first auto-crafting system and a fusion reactor running off of infinite deuterium produced by these pumps. I also made this small sieving setup to make 4 ore every second. If you haven't seen the other parts, I will link them in the description. At the end of the last video, I got the creative mana pool, beginning a new stage of progression and putting me into the endgame. But first, the elephant in the room. I have a new character here, all thanks to Stray. Meet him on my Discord server. Now I can finally get rid of this annoying usage of my Minecraft skin or my old profile picture, and finally I can do this. So after getting the mana pool, I went on a break for a while and played some other mods like Nomi Factory and a beta version of the competitive server coming this April, and I learned a lot about automating and progressing quickly. When I came back to E2E, I completely revamped most of my setups to automate them better, and also did things like expanding the fusion reactor and giving it real coolant instead of water. But once I got back to looking at the mana pool, I realized that I could use a conjuration catalyst under the mana pool to double all of these items using mana, and now I have infinite mana. So I put the mana pool in a box and threw some glowstone in there, then closed it and waited. Well, damn. Okay, we're back. This time let's try a more stable system. Oh, that actually worked. Ah! I'm back again. So what happened was I completely messed up my stabilization, allowing the glowstone to double every second, and in just a minute I had created 85,000 glowstone entities with that many particle effects from my, at the time, shit computer, to render, and it took 10 minutes before my computer was able to close E2E. So I moved the mana pool into this vertical tunnel and manually sent the glowstone into storage using a magnet card on my new wireless storage access. Now that I have a mana pool, I could look towards getting 64 anglesite to make sure I would never have to make it again. Since I have almost all of the machines in the game, getting this wasn't that hard except for these 3 materials. All 3 of them are found on other planets, with energized clathrate found on these 4 planets, resonant clathrate on these 4, and destabilized clathrate on all 5 of these planets. To keep things easy, I decided to stick to planets in our solar system, and I was going to start with the planets that have titanium. But first I need some method of going interplanetary, so I was going to get a material called dilithium from the moon, to power a warp drive, and before that, I actually need to go into space, so it's time to build a rocket. For this, I needed one new machine, a rolling machine with lubricant to make sheets, so it was time to get oil. I ended up drilling the entire area around my base with a drilling rig and a battery to get core samples, but there was no oil. So then I of course switched back to my good friend, the laser drill, that I should have made a lot earlier. Oil can come from oil shale, which is one of the many materials mined in the laser drill that can be easily turned into lots of crude oil. Once I had that steady source of oil, I made this distillation tower for lubricant, gasoline, and diesel, which is very oversimplified. Since I'm a GregTech player, I could explain exactly how oil distillation works, and what products it gives and how we make all of these synthetics out of them, but I don't want to. Another cool byproduct of my oil production and distillation is bitumen and tar, which also just so happen to be the two things I need for rocket fuel in this mixer, and of course we have the lubricant for sheet metal, which I use for the fuel tanks. With all this and many auto-crafted materials, I now have a rocket, 2 fueling stations, a tank brimming with rocket fuel, a rocket assembling machine, and a guidance computer with a course set for the moon. And now it's time for liftoff.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Once I landed on the moon, I used my new Draconic staff of power to mine 5 stacks of dilithium and immediately teleported back to the base because at this point, of course I can teleport interdimensionally. I used the dilithium to build a space station with space for teleporters to all the planets I go to, and a warp drive to go interplanetary. Once in space, I put a stack of dilithium into the warp drive and warped to Europa first. Then I needed to go to the 2 other planets and grab their respective ores. Once I got back, I put all the materials together and made andesite and made an infinite storage access with it. Before I begin working on the creative tank, let's do a factory building speed round. Pressurizer autocrafting, gear autocrafting, mechanism alloy autocrafting, singularity factory, boron nitride factory, zirconium automation, XP automation, a massive garden cloche line constantly growing all of these materials, and finally, another fusion reactor. Except this time it's 2 sizes bigger and more organized. With my factory well and truly fleshed out, it was time to burn the next 2 months for creative items. I say it's time to work on creative items, but in reality I knew that half the materials were things like titanium and Certus quartz, which I could not possibly get in a large enough quantity for some of the recipes ahead. So to fix this, I consulted what I stupidly thought was the source of all E2E knowledge. I go by lots of names, and in his video he mentioned a dimension builder he used to make infinite materials. Sounds like a great idea, let's make some dimensions. How could anything go wrong? This recipe was fairly easy. No huge crafting grids, the materials were almost childish to get, and in reality, getting all 3 of these machines is a matter of being able to get this, the Infinity Catalyst, which probably should have made me just turn around and try for the creative tank, but I didn't. So I began work on the Infinity Catalyst, with the main part being the singularities. If you've watched my other content, you know how painful singularities are. The difference is, I don't need 13 of every singularity, and I'm not making the ultimate singularity, so we only need these 27 singularities, which I did in a terrible method. I was so dead set on resource conservation that I only made one quantum compressor with drawers attached to get just over 10,000 items in it, which would come from storage. To make a singularity, you need 10,000 of either an ingot or a block, depending on the material, in the quantum compressor, which takes a long time to make each singularity. So once I had all that in place, I got it to import iron and then started upgrading ore production. I got this huge new sieve set up since the temporary one from before wasn't that expandable, and I had a lot of bottlenecks. And you may be wondering why I put so many pipes over it, and that's because I decided to ask my model literate friend how I could fix the design, and he said more pipes, so I added more pipes. Now the other part of ore processing. Ore doubling had to be upgraded because this simple sag mill was just too slow for anything, and my enrichment setup is working at a disappointing 7 items a second. So to make this faster, I automated the best capacitors in the game at the time, and put them into an industrial sag mill to triple its speed, and once I had it in place, I was doubling ores at a blistering 60 dust a second, so fast that I would take a stack of iron, instantly crush it all and eject it from the machine, and then wait, since autocrafting can't even input that fast. Now I need to smelt all that dust, so I made an alloy smelter with upgrades that smelted even faster than the mill could crush, which meant that crafting would look like this. In the time I spent upgrading ore processing, I was also switching singularities and occasionally made more than I needed to save for later, and made almost every singularity I needed except for some very special singularities, most notable of which was the flux crystal singularity, which when I break it down requires 40,000 redstone and 10,000 diamonds, which was clinically insane for me to do at the time, especially if you count the 90,000 redstone needed in the redstone singularity. So this meant making some stupid auto-crafting arrays that I think were only used for this and needed lots of babysitting because it didn't actually work. To skip the pain, it took me 3 days of editing ore processing and making singularities for me to finally make this recipe. Now you may be asking, why didn't you mention the other stuff in the recipe? Firstly, this is my channel, don't ask me to tell you anything. Secondly, it was childishly easy, and all of these combined were less difficult than a single singularity. Now I needed to make more Draconic cores, again, and then just 15 minutes of crafting to get all this stuff, which is quite a bit easier than the Infinity Catalyst. With it and these 3 machines, I made my first dimension. I made it of the finest material my base could produce, the basis of all late game progress, spruce logs. After that I made a flux crystal dimension, which did take a while since making these needs over 1,000 of the block you want in the dimension, so I had to make even more flux crystals in this terrible setup until I made the dimension. Once I went in, it seemed pretty safe, so I went mining. While mining an inventory full of crystals, this happened. I instantly died because the dimension ran out of power, collapsed, and killed me with all my stuff in that dimension. Now I had to fix this, but the problem was, this was the largest setback in my entire playthrough. I was now stuck in a corner surrounded by fusion reactor machinery with cables going absolutely everywhere. I had forgotten that I even had a bed here, and more importantly, when I tried flying over to storage... How the hell do I get to storage now? Even worse, no wireless storage. I felt absolutely crippled. Once I got to storage by bridging with cobblestone, I started to plan. I knew I had to get that stuff back, but I needed power to my dimension builder. To do so, I turned to the only good power generation I knew. It was time to build another fusion reactor. For this I made a new sieving setup for netherrack to get boron and lithium, and then I spent a day building this fusion reactor in a much nicer location, only to learn that this power generation wasn't enough, so I built 2 more. Once I stabilized fusion fuel production, I went into the dimension and retrieved my stuff. You'd probably think I'd learned from my mistakes and not use dimensions again, but if you watched my other 2 videos, you know that that's not true, since this makes up half the deaths in the playthrough and 90% of late game deaths. So now we're going to look back to the creative tank. Right now I'm not going to worry about all the liquids at the edges here, and instead I'm going to get the cell frames and the cores in the middle. To get this specific core, the chaotic core, I needed to fight the Chaos Guardian. Now try to point on this map in the end where the Chaos Guardian would be. If you made a guess anywhere on the screen, you're wrong, and you should feel bad. The Chaos Guardian is actually, move the screen, farther, farther, keep going, here, all the way at Z negative 10,000. This, and the fact that it is by far the hardest fight I would ever face in modded Minecraft, meant that I would have to make some armor upgrades to go that far and fight it. So I got together absolutely all of my Draconic evolution capabilities to upgrade all of my Draconic armor, and since Wyvern cores are way too hard to make, I only upgraded things to tier 1, but some are upgraded to tier 2 with Wyvern cores so that my energy shield had a combined strength of 2048 health, with a fast regenerating primary shield of over 200 HP. In short, I had really good armor, and I could also fly at unholy speeds, making the 10,000 block journey just a short walk around the corner. Once I got there, I set some teleporters to the area for the many deaths coming, and flew straight into the fight. Once the fight was over, I ran to the middle and grabbed the Chaos Crystals and teleported back before the island exploded. Since I had already made the Draconic cores required, making this one Chaotic core was fairly easy. The next major part in the creative tank was the resonant cell frames. These are used in every important creative recipe, so I'm going to make all the cell frames at once, much like the angle sight. The hard part of making these is upgrading the empty cell frame to a filled cell, with this huge recipe, which is not only the largest combination crafter I will ever use, but it's also using things like the structure frame. But also there are other chores like this moonstone, which either needs some really refined lapis or an extremely rare ore. Or you could look at the Lapitron crystal, which actually can't be auto-crafted since storage doesn't recognize it or its component as real, and then says that it's waiting for a recipe. Another really annoying part is pulsating mesh, which needs this really weird stuff requiring bees from space and dragon eggs. It's a whole process like that for half of these, but eventually I pulled it off, and at the end of the week I was sitting with a nice 36 resonant cell frames. Now I had one last job, which was getting all of these demonically gargantuan drums, which I must add is an actually amazing name, and I even got one gifted to me from the quest that was filled to the brim, all 21 million buckets, with lube. So I began writing many auto-crafting recipes for these drums that ended up taking way more resources than initially expected, and became the second most expensive part of this labyrinth of a crafting recipe. Finally, the many buckets of every fluid in the game. I'll probably show all liquids on screen right now for the people who actually care about that, but to give you the breakdown: ethanol, put stacks of carrots in these melters and distill it. UU matter, take from the tank that now has over 800 buckets of the stuff. Corium, build a new fission reactor and purposefully melt it down. Essence, I just used an ore dictionary converter on my liquid XP. Empowered canola oil, squeeze canola into oil, then distill it, then laser canola seeds and put them in the canola oil to get crystallized oil, then empower the crystallized seeds and throw them in. You can't make this up. With all that done, I had taken my entire morning away, and finally crafted the creative fluid tank. Once I made the creative fluid tank, I took a break and began planning the next couple of hours. Before I did this, I finally had the motivation and time to start YouTube, and I also realized that I didn't need to use my microwave pickle of a headset mic if I'm not making a commentary video. So I worked a week making my base tour video with absolutely no editing experience, and it did as good as I expected. What, did you think I'm stupid? That's my only video I've ever posted, and how did it even get more than... The thing was even included in a Regan video. Well, now I probably have to progress on E2E, don't I? So once I released that video, I decided to progress in E2E, still without recording, since at the time the video only had 80 views and I didn't want to make a video without a new mic, so back to progression. Once I got back on, I made these 3 setups for filling iridium tanks with duplicated fluids from the creative fluid tank, and made thousands of ingots. Once I had this set up, I began work on other useful creative items. The creative capacitor bank and the creative EU generator could be done at the same time, because all of these items they have in common, and the thing is, in my break, I played GregTech for the first time, and now all these items were trivial to get around. Just autocraft it, and if it's too slow, autocraft harder. In this return, I added almost 200 new autocrafting patterns, doubled the speed of 10 factories, and most importantly now, automated the high-power solar panel. Because of all this speed crafting, I made the creative EU generator and capacitor bank on the same day, and started using them in my base, especially with high-power solar power automation, which needs really high-speed machines to run, so I need a lot of power. Then the actually difficult creative item comes in, the creative gas tank. All that matters in this entire recipe is just these 2 items in the middle because I have everything else. The creative fluid tank is pretty obvious how it's difficult. The creative gas tank frame is arguably as bad because I need 512 buckets of these 9 gases / chemicals, so I made another factory, 2 other factories to generalize the production of half of these chemicals, and then decondense my way to the others. But once I had that, it was easy to finish the creative gas tank, being the last major creative item in the creative vending upgrade, so I can finally move on to the final collection. Except I don't have to work another week on editing that, since I already did on this video. In case you couldn't tell by the fact that I'm talking to you without sounding like this, I got a new mic, so that meant I could finally really begin YouTube. And so I made these 2 videos that explain the end of my playthrough in even more detail than what I'm currently doing. But if you don't want to listen to my first 2 videos, I will give you a summary here. Since I needed so many materials for the 14 of every Singularity, I made 20 ingot formers with infinite molten metal being cooled in them, and then spent a full day making 20 quantum compressors to maximize Singularity production, and at the end of the first video, I got close to making the tier 6 solar array controller. Then I needed a ton of diamonds and emeralds, so I prepared the blocks for those 2 dimensions, and died instantly since I was using more than the integer limit of power, and the dimension would run out of power every 20 seconds, or every 2 seconds if you're running at the FPS of switching dimensions. Then I cheated my stuff back because it was physically impossible to get it back otherwise, and I didn't want to remake all that armor. So I made another dimension out of Certus quartz just 3 days later, and learned that efficiency upgrades exist, so I spent half of my net worth on those just to get the Certus quartz. After that I made a redstone dimension, and a better stable creative mana pool reactor, to make glowstone and some extra redstone. Finally, I grinded for 3 days for 15 of every Singularity to get the infinity ingot. And now I had all the components I needed, and finally, after 430 hours, I assembled the creative vending upgrade. Would I recommend this pack? Well, actually, yes. Its progression line is pretty easy to get your head around if you know what you're doing. My advice for you is, if you're starting out as a modded player, is to maybe play a kitchen sink pack like E2, all the mods, or you could do what I do and try Sky Factory first. And if you want to go big, E2E or Pansmith's better version E2EU is next. You could just jump to them immediately though. You should target ore generation and auto crafting because once you have infinite resources and the means to quickly refine them, you can win pretty easily. Now that E2E is done, I feel like I could take on any challenge. Except for that one. But now E2E mixed with the briefly mentioned Greg technology at the end, I feel like I want to put my skills to the test. No, not you again. I've mentioned Chaos Tech a couple times, and if you're interested, the link to my Discord server is in the description. And to help with all this, I don't want to be that guy, but I spent 6 months making these videos, and the crafting animations seen in all parts were a huge undertaking to make, so I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to get this channel shown to more people.